Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that Michelangelo painted 300 frescoes on the Sistine Chapel ceiling by himself while standing on scaffolding and reaching over his head? Learn how he lived with stonecutters as a child, studied human anatomy, and carved the 17-foot-tall statue of David out of a block of discarded marble. Discover that Michelangelo was only 25 years old when he created the sculpture of Mary, holding the body of Jesus across her lap.
I want you to picture a name, just a name in your head, Michelangelo.
Right.
When you hear that, what actually happens in your brain? Because for most of us, I think it triggers this montage of greatest hits.
Oh, absolutely. The classics.
Yeah, you see the statue of David, you see the finger of God reaching out on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or, you see the Ninja Turtle.
Hopefully not just the Ninja Turtle.
Well, I mean, it's in the mix. But really, the name itself feels heavy. It feels like, it feels like marble.
Permanent.
Exactly. Permanent. Like he was always this giant of history, just born with a chisel in his hand. But looking through this stack of research we have for today's deep dive.
And it is a massive stack.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
We've got biographies, art history papers, some really specific breakdowns of his actual techniques.
Yeah.
And going through it, I realized I actually didn't know the guy at all. I knew the brand, but not the human.
That is honestly the perfect place to start, because in his own time, he wasn't just, a famous artist. He was often referred to as the Divine Hand.
The Divine Hand.
Right. Il Divino. And that nickname, it wasn't thrown around lightly. We're talking about someone who didn't just participate in the Renaissance. He arguably defined the entire trajectory of Western art.
Wow.
Yeah, there's art history before Michelangelo, and there's art history after him. The pivot point is just that distinct.
The Divine Hand. That sounds so, intimidating.
It does.
But the mission of this deep dive is to see if we can get past the divine part and find the actual person. Because the sources paint a picture of someone who was, to put it mildly, intense.
Very intense.
We're talking about a guy who lived in squalor despite being incredibly rich, who was obsessed with his work to the point of ruining his health, and who had a personality that was about as hard as the stone he carved.
It really is a story of obsession. And as we go through the sources today, I think you will see that his genius wasn't just this magical gift that fell from the sky.
Right.
It was the result of a punishing, almost masochistic work ethic.
Yeah.
He pushed his body and his mind to places that most people simply wouldn't go.
So let's go back to the very start, before the masterpieces. March 6, 1475.
Caprese, Tuscany.
Right, he's born in Tuscany. And right off the bat, the sources throw a pretty huge curveball about his childhood.
They do. So he was the second of 5 sons. But the pivotal detail here involves his mother. She became incredibly ill when Michelangelo was just an infant.
She physically couldn't care for him.
Exactly. So the family did something that was relatively common for the time, but in this specific case, it literally changed history. They sent him to live with a wet nurse in the town of Settignano.
But it wasn't just the wet nurse that mattered here. It was who her husband was.
Right. Her husband was a stonecutter, and her father was a stonecutter. So Michelangelo is a toddler, barely walking, and he is living in a house that is essentially part of a quarry.
That is just wild to think about. He's not playing with wooden blocks. He's surrounded by chisels and marble dust.
He actually joked about this later in life. He famously said, "With my wet nurse's milk, I sucked in the hammer and chisels I used for my statues."
That's so poetic.
It is. He felt that the marble dust was literally in his blood before he even knew what art was.
But this leads to a massive conflict, doesn't it? Because his actual father, he wasn't a stonecutter. He had very, very different plans.
Very different. His father, Ludovico, was minor nobility. He was struggling to keep the family prestige afloat. And he wanted Michelangelo to go into the family business.
Which was banking, right?
Banking, or at least some kind of government administration. You really have to understand the class dynamics here. In the late 1400s, sculpture, working with your hands, getting covered in dust that was manual labor.
So it was looked down on.
Greatly. It was seen as something for the lower classes.
So his dad looks at him and basically says, put down the hammer, pick up the ledger.
Exactly. And the sources say Michelangelo had absolutely no aptitude for it. One biography notes he had no ability or desire for the banking lifestyle.
I love that. No ability or desire.
He was stubborn even then. He didn't want to count coins. He wanted to create.
Imagine if he'd listened. Just imagine Michelangelo, the grumpy mid-level banker of Florence.
It would have been a tragedy for human civilization.
Seriously.
But eventually, after what we can assume were some pretty intense screaming matches, his father relented. At 13, Michelangelo is apprenticed to the studio of Domenico Ghirlandaio.
Which is a huge deal.
A massive deal. Ghirlandaio was the master of Florence at the time.
And this is where he learns the basics, specifically fresco painting. Now, I see fresco written on museum plaques all the time, but what is it actually? Is it just like painting on a wall?
It is much, much more technical than that. And this is important for later in his life. Fresco actually means fresh.
Okay.
You apply pigments, which are basically just earth colors mixed with water, directly onto wet lime plaster.
So the wall itself is wet.
Yes, you have to do it while the plaster is still wet.
Oh.
As the plaster dries, a chemical reaction happens, carbonation, and the pigment actually becomes part of the wall surface.
Oh, wow.
It's not a layer of paint sitting on top. It literally is the wall.
So you can't just erase it if you mess up.
Not at all. If you make a mistake, you have to physically chip the plaster off the wall with a hammer and start over. It requires immense confidence and speed.
Which he clearly had. But the sources say he didn't stay with Ghirlandaio long. He kind of outgrew it. Or he got poached.
A bit of both, really. And this brings us to the Medici Gardens.
Right, the Medici family.
Yes. If Ghirlandaio's studio was high school, the Medici Gardens was an Ivy League PhD program mixed with a royal court. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, took notice of this young teenager and invited him to study in his personal sculpture gardens.
And this isn't just about learning to carve better, right? This is where his brain basically gets rewired.
Completely. He is living in the Medici Palace. He sits at the dining table with the greatest philosophers, poets, and humanists of the Renaissance.
Just absorbing all of it.
He's absorbing Neoplatonism, this idea that the physical body is a reflection of the divine spirit. This is where he stops being just a craftsman and starts being an intellectual.
But while his mind is up in the clouds with the philosophers, the sources mention he was doing something else that was, well, extremely grounded and frankly, pretty gross.
Oh, yes.
He starts studying anatomy.
He does. And we need to be very clear about what studying anatomy meant in the 1490s.
It wasn't an app.
No. There were no textbooks with clear diagrams. There were no plastic models. To learn anatomy, you had to get special permission from the Roman Catholic Church to access the hospital mortuary.
So he's dissecting corpses.
He is dissecting actual human bodies. And remember, there is no refrigeration.
Oh, man.
There is no formaldehyde. He is working on decomposing bodies, likely by candlelight, often entirely alone at night.
That literally sounds like a horror movie.
Yeah.
Why would an artist do that? I mean, do you really need to know what a liver looks like to carve a statue?
Well, you don't need to know the liver, but you definitely need to know the mechanics. He wanted to understand exactly how a muscle fiber attaches to a bone.
Like the engineering of the body.
Exactly. He wanted to know, if you twist an arm 45 degrees, which tendon pops out and which one flattens. The sources mention this took a huge, huge toll on his health.
I can imagine.
The smell, the risk of infection, the psychological weight of it. He often couldn't eat for days afterward.
But see, this is the biggest takeaway for me. When you look at his statues and you see that tension, that alive quality, that didn't come from looking at a model posing in a sunny studio.
No.
It came from him peeling back skin in a freezing basement.
Precisely. He wasn't sculpting the surface. He was sculpting what was underneath, pushing out. That is the fundamental difference between Michelangelo and everyone who came before him.
So let's talk about the results of all this gruesome research, the big works. We have to start with the Pietà.
The Pietà, commissioned by a French cardinal, Jean de Belair, and Michelangelo is roughly 24 or 25 years old here.
25. I mean, at 25, I was still trying to figure out how to do my taxes. And he's carving one of the world's greatest masterpieces.
And he's doing it out of a single block of Carrara marble. This is important to note. If he makes one wrong strike with the hammer,
If he hits it too hard,
if he cracks the stone too deep, the entire 2-year project is ruined. There's no undo button with marble.
the piece is Mary holding the dead body of Jesus. Pietà meaning pity or compassion. It's incredibly sad, but also just so peaceful.
Yeah.
But there's a story in the notes about the signature on this one. Apparently, this is the only thing he ever signed.
Yes, the only one. The story goes that shortly after it was unveiled, he overheard some people attributing the work to another artist, a rival from Milan.
Oh, I bet he loved that.
He was furious, so he snuck back into the church at night with his chisels and a lamp, and he literally carved his name directly across the sash on Mary's chest.
He went right across the front.
Carved. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this.
Talk about a chip on your shoulder. Just so we're clear, I did this.
He later regretted it, actually. He felt it was a moment of pride that wasn't becoming of the work, and he never signed another piece.
Okay, so he absolutely nails the Pietà. He's a star now.
Yeah.
But then comes David. And this story is my favorite because it basically starts with a piece of garbage.
It essentially does. The David wasn't a fresh commission where he got to go to the quarry and pick his materials. He was given a block of marble that was legendary for being a total disaster.
Notes call it the giant.
Yes. It was a massive 17-foot block of marble, but it had been botched. Two other sculptors, one of them 40 years earlier, had tried to work on it and just gave up.
40 years, it was just sitting there.
Sitting out in the elements, neglected. They said the stone was flawed, it was too narrow, and it had been hacked at so badly that you couldn't get a proper figure out of it.
So the city officials are basically looking for someone to clean up this very heavy, very expensive mess. And Michelangelo says, I'll take it.
He says, I can see David in there. It's an incredible act of vision. He had to work entirely within the mistakes of the previous sculptors. If you look at David closely, the figure is actually quite slender from the side because the block was so narrow. He didn't have room to expand. He had to find the figure inside the limitations he was given.
And the result is, well, it's David. It's the definition of perfection. But just as he's basking in this glory, he gets summoned by the Pope, Pope Julius II. And this is where the story shifts from sculpture back to painting.
And Michelangelo was not happy about it. He considered himself a sculptor first and foremost. He famously said, painting is not my art.
But you don't really say no to Pope Julius II.
You do not. He was known as the warrior pope. He was a terrifying guy.
So the Pope wants him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But originally the request was pretty simple, right? Just the 12 apostles.
Right. A geometric pattern and the 12 apostles. A standard, almost decorative job. But Michelangelo, being Michelangelo, looked at it and said, that's too poor.
Too poor.
He convinced the Pope to let him do something much, much bigger.
And bigger turned out to be over 300 individual figures covering 12,000 square feet.
A complete retelling of Genesis. The creation, the fall of man, the flood.
Now, I need to clear something up here, because I've always had this image in my head of him lying on his back on some scaffolding, just painting comfortably. But the research says that's a complete myth.
It is a total myth. It was largely popularized by a movie in the 1960s. He didn't lie down at all. He invented a specialized scaffolding system where he stood up.
He stood up?
He stood up, and he had to crane his neck backward, looking straight up at the ceiling for hours and hours at a time.
Just try doing that right now. Like, look up at your ceiling.
Yep.
Now imagine holding a brush. Now imagine doing that for 4 years.
It was pure torture. He actually wrote a poem about it to a friend. He describes his goiter swelling from the strain, his spine getting distorted, his face becoming a rich mosaic from all the paint just constantly dripping down onto it.
That sounds miserable.
And remember the fresco technique? He was working in wet plaster, so it was humid, it was moldy. He effectively ruined his eyesight and his posture for the ceiling.
And yet, out of that absolute misery comes the creation of Adam. That image of God and Adam reaching for each other. It's arguably the most famous painting in the world.
It really captures the entire humanist ideal of the Renaissance. God granting man not just life, but intellect, the divine spark.
It was finally revealed to the public on October 31st, 1512. And he survives it. He survives the ceiling. He goes back to sculpture. And this brings us to a specific piece that I found really confusing when I first saw the pictures in our source material.
Yeah, I know where you're going.
It's the statue of Moses.
Yes.
He carved this for Pope Julius II's tomb. It's an incredible figure. He's powerful, bearded, holding the tablets of the law. But he has horns.
He does.
Like actual goat horns growing right out of his head. Why on earth did Michelangelo give Moses horns? Was he making some kind of subversive statement?
He was making a statement, but definitely not the one you think. He was actually trying to be as accurate as possible. This is a fascinating example of how a single word can change history.
Is it a translation thing?
It is exactly a translation thing. Karen means to shine or emitting rays of light.
Okay, so he was glowing. That makes total sense.
But ancient Hebrew is written without vowels, And the root word, KRN, can also be read as Karen, which means horn.
Oh, boy.
So when St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, creating the Vulgate, which was the official Bible of the Catholic Church, he translated it as cornuta, horned.
No way. So for 1,000 years, everyone just legitimately thought Moses had horns.
Essentially, yes. It became the standard iconography in art. Michelangelo, being a deeply devout Christian who read his Bible closely, simply followed the text. The Latin Bible said horns, so he carved horns.
He was just following the brief?
Exactly. He wasn't trying to make Moses look demonic in any way. He was trying to show his divinity based strictly on the text he had.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. A typo in the Bible leads to a priceless masterpiece with horns. It really makes you think about how we interpret history based on whatever information we happen to have at the moment.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder that even a genius of his level is limited by the context of his time.
So we're moving into his later years now. He's conquered sculpture, he's conquered painting, and in his 70s, which is basically ancient for the 16th century, he takes on a completely new role, architect of St. Peter's Basilica.
Started in 1452, but he takes over in 1546. And again, he didn't want the job. He was not Pope Paul's first choice either. He was old, he was tired, and he knew the project was an absolute mess. Construction had been stalling for decades.
But the Pope insisted.
The Pope insisted.
The sources quote him saying something really profound about why he finally accepted it. He said, "I undertake this only for the love of God and in honor of the apostle."
That phrase, the love of God, it really seems to be the engine that kept him running through all the pain. We see it in his poetry, we see it in his personal letters.
The source material actually draws a really interesting parallel here to a scripture. 4th Nephi, chapter 1, verse 15.
Right.
It talks about a people who had no contention in the land because of the love of God which did dwell in the hearts of the people.
It's a compelling connection to make because Michelangelo's external life was full of contention. He fought constantly with popes, he fought with his assistants, he fought with his own family.
Screening matches.
Right. But internally, it seems that this love of God gave him a singular, unbreakable focus. It allowed him to strip away the worldly distractions and focus entirely on the work. It was his way of eliminating the internal noise, even if he couldn't eliminate the external conflict.
He worked right up until the very end, didn't he?
He did. He was physically chipping away at a new Pietà just days before he died. He passed away in Rome in 1564 following a brief illness, just weeks before his 89th birthday.
89 years old. He lived through the High Renaissance, the Reformation, the sack of Rome. I mean, he saw it all.
And even though he died in Rome, the sources emphasize that he never stopped considering himself a Florentine. His body was actually smuggled out of Rome.
Smuggled out.
Hidden in a bale of hay, secretly transported so he could be buried back home in Florence.
Smuggled in hay. That is a dramatic end for a very dramatic life.
Fitting, I think.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've looked at the stonecutter's toddler, the anatomist dealing with corpses in the dark, the painter destroying his own body for a ceiling, and the reluctant architect. We started by asking who the man was behind the divine hand.
And I think the answer is that he was a man of immense contradictions. He was rough and gritty, but he created the smoothest, most divine forms imaginable. He was deeply religious, but constantly at war with the church hierarchy. He was a man who saw the ultimate potential in everything, even a ruined, hacked-up block of marble.
That's the real takeaway for me, having the vision to see David inside the garbage. But before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final thought that's been nagging at me since we talked about the Moses statue.
The translation error.
Yeah. Think about it. We look back at history, and we often treat it as this solid, unchangeable list of facts, like stone. But we just learned today that one of the most iconic depictions of a biblical prophet has horns because of a single ambiguous word. Karen versus Karen. Rays versus horns.
It is a sobering realization.
It really makes you wonder if a single mistranslation can completely change the face of a masterpiece like Moses for centuries. How many other facts that we just blindly accept about history are simply misunderstandings that got set in stone?
That is a very good question for everyone to chew on.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Michelangelo.
Thank you.
We'll catch you on the next one.
May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.